Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really honored to have Matt Pottinger with us. He's the CEO of Garnaut Global, an open source research firm focusing on Trump 2.0 and Asia. He's also a distinguished senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he was Deputy National Security Advisor under Trump's first administration. Today, he's here to talk about his most recent book, an edited volume called The Boiling Moat, about the risks of a potential contingency, a potential war over Taiwan. And I read this book over the weekend. It's startling, in a constructive way, I'll say. My own copy has a lot of notes and a lot of markings on it. And I do think it is a very important read, and he's going to say a few words about his book and the findings in there and what it means for Japan and Japanese private sector. And then we'll turn it over to you for questions. So without further ado, Matt, the floor is yours.
Paul, thank you for having me today. It's great to be with you all. Thanks for making time during your lunch hour. And I also want to thank the Institute of Geoeconomics as well, and to give thanks also. I think the translator of my book, which just came out in Japan this week, is here as well, and it's General Oe, who here he is. Yeah, thank you, General Oe. Thank you so much for all the care that you took in translating the book. It's really quite special to have you here. I thought that I could talk for a few minutes about how serious, how urgent I believe the situation is with respect to Taiwan, but also to say that there is good reason to be hopeful, because as we look at how deterrence works, the act of deterrence, deterrence is really a psychological act, right? What you're trying to do is persuade your adversary, in this case, not only the Chinese Communist Party, the communist regime in China, but actually the one man at the top of that system who is the sole decision maker on matters of war and peace. His name is Xi Jinping. Deterrence is really an act of psychology to persuade Xi Jinping that the costs of trying to go to war to coerce and capture Taiwan should not be worth the cost to him. So how do we raise the cost for him? You have to do it with a mix of capability, meaning that you have to show that you have the military capabilities to fight not only a short conflict, but to fight a long conflict, and that you have the resolve to fight in the event that Xi Jinping makes that fateful decision to go to war. And so the book, The Boiling Moat, what my co-authors and I sought to do was to describe what urgent steps Taiwan needs to take now in order to increase deterrence, the steps that the United States needs to take now to increase deterrence, but also 2 chapters of the book are about what Japan needs to do, because I think people underestimate how important Japan is as what we call a swing vote, a swing state that can actually tilt towards the calculus in Xi Jinping's mind from being encouraged that he should attack to feeling discouraged that the cost of trying to attack would be too high. Japan has an incredibly important role to make here. Now, I was very fortunate that my 2 co-authors who wrote about Japan included Colonel Grant Newsham. Grant Newsham is a former Marine who was the first liaison to the Japan Self-Defense Forces. He played an important role also working at the U.S. Embassy in Japan on more than one occasion as an attaché officer. So he wrote a very excellent chapter of the book that lays out steps that Japan needs to take. And then also Admiral Koda Yoji-san, who wrote also an excellent chapter. And one of the things that Admiral Koda wrote about were first how important it is to remember that a conflict initiated by China against Taiwan may not be the only conflict at that moment. It might encourage or even involve coordination with two other major adversaries of Japan, the North Korean regime and also Russia. And we've seen that Russia has been training alongside China to help China in the event that China decides it wants to create an emergency over Taiwan. North Korea is now fighting alongside Russian soldiers. They committed something on the order of 10,000 North Korean troops to fight and kill Europeans in the largest European war since World War II. Now, from what I'm reading from Ukrainian officials is that those soldiers are dying almost as fast as they can arrive on the battlefield, and that North Korea may actually be withdrawing some of those fighting forces. They were not well prepared to fight against the hardened forces of Ukraine. But nonetheless, you can see that China, North Korea, and Russia are working in closer and closer concert. They are already cooperating in a war in Europe, and we should expect that they may well, as Admiral Koda warns us, they may well decide to coordinate their activities if China decides to attack Taiwan. That means that Japan has significant work to do to make itself more than just a shield while America serves as a spear. That model is sort of the old model that we've been living under, that Japan will do some work to protect U.S. bases, protect U.S. supply lines, but Americans can go fight and do the dying on behalf of Taiwan. We probably don't have the luxury of thinking in those terms anymore. Japan has to be able to wield a shield and a spear, just like the United States has to be able to wield a shield and a spear simultaneously in order to bring about deterrence, or if deterrence fails, to be able to fight effectively and to win in a war in the Western Pacific. So I would encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. The Japanese edition, you'll see in those chapters by Admiral Koda and Grant Newsham some of the specific things that we lay out that we think Japan needs to do. And I look forward to our conversation today.
Now, as the moderator, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and begin to ask the first few questions. Like I said at the introduction, the book is a shocking read, constructively, but it's shocking because what you describe in the event of a Taiwan contingency almost sounds like nothing less than the greatest geopolitical cataclysm since World War II. So I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. What are we looking at the day after a contingency over Taiwan, a military invasion, a military effort by the PRC to take over the island? And more specifically, what does that mean for Japan? What changes? What do Japanese citizens need to worry about beyond just the fact that it would be a tragedy for Taiwan? How would their lives change? What would matter for them in that kind of scenario?
Very good question. I think, and we tackle in some depth in the second chapter of this book, what does the world look like if China coercively annexes Taiwan? It is a very, very dark outcome for Japan, as well as for other countries in the region and for the United States. There are geostrategic implications having to do with the geography. There are economic implications, and then there are implications for the nature of governance in this part of the world, democracy versus autocracy. If you read Chinese military textbooks, and we quote one of them or a couple of them in this book, Chinese military textbooks say that as soon as Taiwan is conquered, Japan will have lost the ability to prevent a blockade of Japan, and that in fact, according to China's military textbooks, China will be able to threaten not only to cut off energy and trade, but even to induce a famine in Japan, to starve Japanese people to death. And I don't think they're entirely wrong in believing that by taking Taiwan, it would give them the ability to, basically, Beijing's military is no longer containable. Right now, we use this phrase, the first island chain. And Beijing uses this phrase, first island chain, as well, because it's an accurate description of the islands leading from the United States and Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, down to Japanese islands, Nansei Shoto, all the way to Taiwan, and then the Philippines onto really all the way down to Australia. Anytime Chinese submarines or ships or aircraft want to go out into the Pacific, they have to go through this island chain, which means that we have enormous leverage. By we, I mean Japan and the United States and Taiwan and other democratic friends and allies of the United States, like Australia, Palau, and of course the Philippine Islands. So if Taiwan were to disappear or become a giant base for the People's Liberation Army of China, it means that China now has a means to send large numbers of military forces up and around the east side of Japan. And Japan's defensive concept depends on Taiwan as an anchor to ensure that there is control, there's the ability to constrain or contain Chinese military. So that's the geographic threat. In China's own words, they can starve Japan to death if Taiwan falls. Second is economic. The technological side. Taiwan is at the very heart of the high-end technology supply chain today. 93 or more % of the most cutting-edge semiconductors are made in Taiwan. And there's no other company in the world besides Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp that knows how to make chips as well as they make them, at scale, as cheaply as they make them. Samsung can make some chips, but it's a single-digit percentage. Intel Corporation can't make any of them. Intel Corp has been left behind in the dust. It's no longer a relevant company, and it probably won't be around much longer in its current form. Then, if Taiwan is conquered, you suddenly have a situation where all of the most valuable technology, the most valuable companies in the world, including American companies like NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, Dell, and Oracle, these companies will no longer have access to chips that are essential for them to have leadership. That means the United States and Japan begin to fall behind in artificial intelligence, for example, and other key technologies. China begins to dominate those technologies. That will be very detrimental to our economic prosperity and our national security. And then there's the question, finally, of the nature of governance. Taiwan is, by many measures, a more successful democracy than even Japan and the United States, according to Freedom House and some of these other groups, the Economist magazine and others that track these indices. And by the way, it is a society that has a strong Chinese heritage, that speaks Chinese language, and it has demonstrated that democracy can work in a society that is culturally and in large part ethnically Chinese. If that is then extinguished because the Chinese Communist Party decides to destroy democracy in Taiwan, which is what would happen, of course, if China invades, it will start to change the calculus throughout the region about whether or not democracy can work. And that will have reverberations all over the world.
Thank you for that. I told you it was startling. So let's turn to the current status of efforts to maintain the status quo. Because obviously last Friday at least Japan Standard Time, Prime Minister Ishiba met with President Trump. The meeting is generally considered to have gone well. There was language specific to Taiwan in the joint statement that referred to opposing any unilateral efforts to change the status quo, which I think most everyone would consider to be a good development. At the same time, there seemed to be persistent rumors that Trump would either not come to Taiwan's defense in a contingency, or that Taiwan may even be on the table if there was a hypothetical grand bargain with China. A, can you speak to those rumors? B, how do you reconcile the fact that there are, frankly, a lot of people in the Trump administration currently who seem to be a little bit more ambivalent about the future of Taiwan, with the very real necessity that you've outlined to maintain the status quo?
Yeah, so look, I think you're right. There are some people who are ambivalent. I have not met one American who has actually looked at the problem who is ambivalent. So in other words, those who express ambivalence about the fate of Taiwan, without exception, have not actually looked at the problem carefully, without exception. President Trump is not one of those people. I had many conversations with President Trump over the years when I was his Asia senior director and then his deputy national security advisor. I think that he grew to appreciate over time just how significant Taiwan is for America's prosperity and its national security, and that if Taiwan were to be annexed on his watch, it will capsize President Trump's presidency. He will experience a 1929-style stock market crash, and he will be considered to have had a failed presidency if that happens. So I think that as I listen to his commentary and how he's commented publicly about Taiwan over the years, it's still within the recent American tradition going back really to 1979, 1980, of what I would call strategic ambiguity. That is to say, he is not committing in either direction to abandon or to fight on Taiwan's behalf. That has been American policy for every president going all the way back to Jimmy Carter, with the exception of President Joe Biden. President Joe Biden was the first US president to say publicly, not once but 4 times, that he would defend Taiwan militarily if China attacked. That was unusual for a president to state a policy in those terms. So now, I know that people in the region often worry, I hear this question a lot, what would President Trump do? The real question that we Americans have in response is what are the countries in this region doing to build confidence in the United States that we all have one another's back, that this isn't just an American problem, the fate of Taiwan, it is all of our problem. And as a friend of mine in Taiwan says, heaven helps those who help themselves. Heaven helps those who help themselves. So if Taiwan and if Japan increase defense spending, if they start to fix their shortages in manpower, Japan has a serious recruiting crisis. This is a problem that has nothing to do with the United States. This is a Japanese problem, and it's fixable, but Japan has to take the steps to show greater respect and honor for your men and women in uniform. I learned some time ago while I was researching this book that Japanese soldiers are discouraged from wearing their uniform, even their service uniform, on trains or in public. That is a mistake. Those young men and women are your future. They are the ones who have taken an oath to protect Japan from some pretty scary enemies. These are totalitarian dictatorships with nuclear weapons. North Korea, Russia, totalitarian dictatorship with nuclear weapons. The People's Republic of China, totalitarian dictatorship with nuclear weapons. You have these incredible young men and women. I've met Japanese service personnel over the years. I was a Marine stationed in Okinawa when I was younger, and I got to interact with Japanese self-defense forces. They were superb. They're excellent. Japan needs to take steps to help itself, and that creates a positive spiral, a reinforcing spiral that it increases American confidence, and that in turn will increase Japanese confidence that we can together fight if necessary. Better yet, we can deter so that we don't have to fight.
Sorry, just a few words on the Trump-Ishiba meeting on Friday.
Well,
quick reaction.
It looked very good to me. This was a lot of people were worried that Prime Minister Ishiba would not be able to generate chemistry with President Trump because President Trump had a very good relationship with Prime Minister Abe. I was in all of Prime Minister Abe's meetings with President Trump and on all of those phone calls. I can tell you that I think this was very good optics. It looked very positive to me. Prime Minister Ishiba was only the second leader to visit President Trump since President Trump's inauguration. You had the Israeli Prime Minister there shortly before, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then the first meeting after Israel is Japan. This is excellent. I think it's a very good statement. If you read the statement that you referenced, the public joint statement that came out, very positive. There's a major agreement on LNG, so that not only Japan, but really this opens up markets in Taiwan and in South Korea for American LNG, so that Japan and Korea and Taiwan don't have to be dependent on less reliable sources or suffer the threat that those sources would be cut off. So I thought it looked very good.
You talk about deterrence quite a lot, and probably the immediate analog to any Taiwan contingency would probably be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, in the build-up to that, the Biden administration, and I believe administrations prior to that, had promised, crippling economic sanctions against Russia. They were imposed, they went into effect, invasion still going on literally as we speak. So, what kind of lessons do you take from deterrence in Russia-Ukraine, and how do you learn from that experience to try to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen with PRC, People's Republic of China, and Taiwan?
Vladimir Putin learned the hard way that war is really, really hard. And he learned it attacking a neighboring country that had no water between their borders. They were able to just drive tanks and armored personnel carriers and march troops right into Ukraine. And even with that relatively easy ingress, easy pathway in, the Russians have lost perhaps 700,000 men. 700,000 men, either wounded or killed in action on the Russian side. So we should take heart from the fact that if you have the will to fight, the resolve to fight, that is the X factor. That is the most important factor in both deterring or defeating an enemy. And the Ukrainians have incredible resolve. So even though the odds were against them, they have held out. Now, if you then look at Taiwan, the natural advantages that Taiwan has compared to Ukraine are immense. The Chinese military would have to cross 100 miles of ocean. Imagine if the Ukrainians had 100 miles of ocean separating them from Russia. I don't think Russia would have even attempted this. Taiwan has a very formidable geography. The east side is high mountains. It's like a wall, a fortress. The west side has long, muddy flats that are very difficult to land an amphibious assault on those long, muddy beaches without troops being very vulnerable. the invaders being made very vulnerable. So Admiral Koda, in his chapter of the book, talks about the experience of the Battle of Okinawa. Why did he talk about the Battle of Okinawa? This was a battle that ultimately the invaders, the United States, won. Yet he believes that there is an important deterrent lesson in that battle for Beijing. The Battle of Okinawa involved a late stage of the Pacific War when Japan already had lost most of its industrial capacity. Japan no longer had allies it could depend on. It was isolated. Japan had no control or even real ability to contest the seas or the skies. So America had a totally dominant position as it invaded Okinawa. And what ensued was one of the hardest battles, the single hardest battle for the United States in the Pacific War, where it took more than 500,000 men in support or invading troops. It took them 3 months to subdue a tiny, tiny island, 1/20th the size of Taiwan, something like that. So it goes to show you that if you have will to fight, you can use geography to your benefit and defeat a superior force. So Beijing should think 3 times before it attempts anything against Taiwan.
Okay, so thanks for that example. You've laid out a very concerning scenario. You've laid out the risks to Japan and to the world economy and to democracies all over the globe. Now, say you are a Japanese private company. Say you're the kind of company that already is highly attuned to these sort of risks, which is why you may have hypothetically, pursued corporate membership with a think tank that focuses on this stuff, and say you spend your days going to events with former deputy national security advisors to talk about these things. Say you're one of those companies, hypothetically. What do you do now and in the years ahead to try to, I guess, 2 things: either prepare your own company for the worst, or 2, help support Taiwan, help deter, help raise the costs and push out the timeline so that the worst case scenario doesn't happen?
Great. So I'm going to talk in a moment a little bit about how to interpret President Donald Trump and his intentions in what I think his goals are in this second Trump term. But before I do that, I want to say a few specific things that I think Japan can do, and that involves public-private partnerships. It involves Japanese corporations stepping up as well, right? One of them I already mentioned, which is to love your soldiers. And, if you want to recruit, you have to show that this society respects and honors those young men and women who are willing to put on the uniform and willing to sacrifice their lives for Japan. That means they should probably be paid better. It means they should have access to better training facilities. Why is it that Japanese soldiers have to go to Australia or come to the United States to do realistic live fire exercises? They should be able to train in Japan effectively, and they should be able to host foreign forces to do more realistic, more dangerous, risky training inside of Japan. The other is the industrial base. What we're learning from the war in Ukraine is that those countries that are able to adapt fastest and not only innovate technology but produce it en masse are more likely to win on the battlefield. And that cycle used to take decades. America would spend decades investing in a new capability, and then it would take years for it to be brought into the forces, and then years to train on those things. In Ukraine, in the space of 3 years, you've seen multiple generations of new types of drones and new ways to use drones, new ways of using or defeating electronic warfare, ways of sinking advanced navies using improvised autonomous drones on the water. You can actually watch on YouTube how Ukraine destroyed much of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea using jet skis, remote-controlled jet skis filled with explosives, and they would hit a billion-dollar warship. They would hit with a jet ski, and then another jet ski would drive into the hole and explode and sink a billion-dollar warship. So things are changing very, very quickly. Japan has a natural advantage in your industrial base, your technology dominance, your engineering core, and so I think it's time to really turn that on and for Japan to become more of an arsenal for democracies. South Korea has been playing this role, providing munitions to the European countries so that those European countries can provide their older stocks of weapons to the Ukrainians. Japan should be exporting weapons, in my view. It should be exporting weapons. I'll pause there.
Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our time today. This has been a really rewarding conversation, I think, and I hope you all got a lot out of it. So, Matt, thanks for coming, and please join me in thanking Matt and his team for coming here today. Thank you so much.